Story 1. There's an old man who lives up in the woods, a good few miles from the nearest road. They call him the Hermit. No one really knows his real name, and he never comes down to town for supplies. People say he's been out there for decades, living in this tiny, beat-up cabin tucked deep in the trees. They say he's strange but harmless. Or at least, that's what I used to believe. Last winter, I had a few days off work, so I decided to go hiking near those woods, the ones close to where the hermit supposedly lived. I had heard the stories, of course. Curious more than anything, I figured I'd take a detour, see if I could spot the cabin. I wasn't planning to go near it. Just a quick look, you know? I'm not one to mess with other people's business. I packed up my gear and set off early in the morning. The woods were quiet that time of year, the kind of quiet that presses in on you from all sides. The snow wasn't too thick yet, but it was enough to muffle my footsteps. After about 2 hours of hiking, I started to get this weird feeling, like I was being watched. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone out there. But then, in the distance, I saw it. A small, weathered cabin, half hidden by trees and shadows. The roof sagged in the middle, and smoke was curling up from a rusty chimney. That had to be it. The hermit's place. I stood there, just staring for a moment. It looked so isolated, like it had been forgotten by the world. But then something strange happened. The front door creaked open, just a little. I hadn't heard anyone approach or any movement from inside, but there it was, cracked open as if inviting me in. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I ignored it. I couldn't help myself. I took a few steps closer, just to peek inside, just to see if anyone was really living out there. As I approached, the door swung open wider, almost on its own. Inside, the cabin was dark, but I could make out a single chair facing the window, a small fire crackling in a stone fireplace, and something else, something shiny, hanging on the far wall. I stepped closer, squinting to get a better look, and that's when I saw them, dozens of animal traps, rusty and jagged, hanging from hooks. They weren't like any traps I'd ever seen before. They looked old, cruel, designed to cause pain. My skin crawled at the sight of them. I backed away, but before I could turn around, I heard it, the slow creak of floorboards. Someone was inside. My heart started pounding in my chest as I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. A tall, gaunt figure, shrouded in shadow, was standing in the doorway. His face was obscured by a thick beard and wild, unkempt hair, but his eyes, those eyes were locked on me, cold and unblinking. It was him, the hermit. For a long, tense moment, neither of us moved. He just stood there, watching me. His eyes flicked to the traps hanging on the wall, then back to me, like he was daring me to ask about them. I didn't mean to intrude. I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. My breath clouded in the cold air, and my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. I wanted to run, but I was frozen, pinned by his gaze. Without saying a word, the hermit reached for something near the door. My blood ran cold when I saw what it was, a large hunting knife, the blade dull with age but still deadly. He held it loosely at his side, almost casually, but his message was clear. I wasn't welcome. My brain screamed at me to move, but it felt like time had slowed down, like I was watching the scene unfold from outside my body. Then, with a sharp jolt of adrenaline, I snapped back to reality. I turned on my heel and bolted, not even caring about making noise anymore. I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate. He wasn't running, but he was following. Branches clawed at my jacket as I tore through the woods, my lungs burning, the cold air stabbing at my throat. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But I knew he was there. I could feel him, pacing me, like a predator stalking its prey. After what felt like an eternity, I broke out of the trees and onto a dirt road. I finally dared to glance back, and for the first time, I saw him standing at the tree line, just watching me. The knife still dangled from his hand, but he made no move to come closer. He didn't need to. His message was clear. I wasn't supposed to come back. I didn't stop running until I got to my car. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I sped away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the road, watching, waiting. I've never been back to those woods. People still talk about the hermit, still say he's just a harmless old man who keeps to himself. But I know better. There's something off about him, something dangerous. And every time I hear his name, I think about those traps hanging on his wall, waiting for something or someone to wander too close. Story 2. This happened about 4 years ago, and I still think about it every time I walk to my car alone. I was living in a small town in rural Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. One night, I stayed late at work to finish up a few things. It was the dead of winter, and by the time I left, it was already pitch black outside. You know that kind of cold where it's so quiet you can hear your own breathing? Yeah, that kind of night. The parking lot was almost empty, just a couple of cars dotted here and there, mine all the way at the end. As I walked toward my car, I got that feeling like someone was watching me. You know, that deep-rooted instinct you can't quite explain. My stomach tightened, but I shrugged it off. I'm just being paranoid, I told myself, pulling my coat tighter around me. I fumbled with my keys as I approached the car, the cold making my hands stiff. The moment I unlocked the door, I heard a sound behind me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the crunchy snow. I froze. The parking lot was nearly empty, and there was no reason for anyone to be walking behind me at that hour. My heart started pounding in my chest. I remember gripping my keys so tightly that one of them dug into my palm. Don't look back, I told myself. Just get in the car and lock the doors. But I couldn't help it. I had to look. There, not 10 feet behind me, was a man. He wasn't wearing a coat, despite the freezing weather. Just a hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. His hands were in his pockets, and he was just standing there, watching me. My brain went into overdrive. Was he going to rob me? Attack me? I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I yanked open my car door, jumped in, and slammed it shut. The guy didn't move, just kept staring at me through the windshield. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key into the ignition. As soon as the engine roared to life, I hit the lock button and threw the car into reverse. I didn't care if I hit something, I just needed to get out of there. As I backed out of the spot, the man finally moved. He started walking toward my car, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. He had a knife in his hand. It wasn't until I was halfway down the road that I realized I was hyperventilating. My mind was racing. Who was that guy? Why was he just standing there? What would have happened if I hadn't noticed him in time? I went straight home, locked every door and window, and didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I reported the incident to the police, but they didn't seem to take it too seriously. Maybe it was just a homeless guy, they said. He was probably just looking for some money. But I knew better. The way he stood there, the knife, he wasn't looking for money. He was looking for me. I never stayed late at work again after that night. And every time I walk to my car in the dark, I still get that same sickening feeling in my gut. Because whoever he was, he's still out there. Story 3. It happened about a year ago, and honestly, I still get chills thinking about it. I was visiting my sister and her husband, who lived in a pretty isolated house outside of town. They had just moved in, and the area was super rural. Nothing but fields, trees, and empty roads for miles. The kind of place where you don't see another house for ages. One night, we were all sitting in the living room watching a movie. My sister's husband had gone to bed early since he had work in the morning, so it was just me and her. It was around midnight when we started hearing a faint knocking sound. At first, I thought it was part of the movie, but then it got louder, more persistent, like someone was knocking on a window. We paused the movie, and my sister gave me this look, kind of half laughing, half worried. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I nodded, but I was already on edge. They didn't have close neighbors, so someone knocking on the window in the middle of nowhere felt off. Really off. We muted the TV, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then there was again 3 slow, deliberate knocks. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was from the back of the house. My sister stood up, more curious than scared, but I could feel my heart rate starting to spike. "Let's check it out," she said, grabbing her phone and heading toward the kitchen, where the back door was. I followed her, but every step felt heavy, like my body knew something was wrong before my brain did. As we got to the kitchen, I realized the knocking wasn't coming from the door, but from one of the windows. My sister walked over, pulled the curtain aside, and froze. I'll never forget the look on her face. It was this mix of shock and fear. I couldn't help myself. I stepped closer and looked out the window too. Standing there, just outside, was a man. He was wearing this old, dirty jacket, and he had this creepy, calm expression on his face, like he wasn't fazed at all by standing outside a stranger's house in the middle of the night. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and he was staring straight at us, like he had been watching us for a while. My stomach dropped. For a second, none of us moved. It was like time had stopped. Then, the man smiled, this slow, unsettling grin, and raised his hand, tapping on the glass with his finger. 3 more knocks, deliberate and slow, as if he was trying to get a reaction out of us. "We need to call someone," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. But my sister just stood there, frozen in place. I grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the window, feeling like if we didn't do something, this guy was going to break in. We ran into the living room, locked the front and back doors, and tried calling the police. I could hear my sister's voice shaking as she talked to the dispatcher, explaining there was a man outside our house, just watching us. The dispatcher told us to stay inside, stay on the phone, and wait for the police to arrive. We sat there in the living room, staring at the kitchen door, hearts pounding, every creak of the house making us jump. I kept expecting to hear the sound of a window breaking or the back door creaking open. The worst part was the silence. The knocking had stopped, but we knew he was still out there, watching. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably just 10 minutes, we saw the headlights of a police car pull into the driveway. When they knocked on the door, we were practically shaking as we let them in. But here's the thing, the man was gone. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the kitchen window, but they stopped there. No tracks leading away, no sign of where he'd gone. The police searched the area, even the woods around the house, but they didn't find anyone. They told us it was probably just some drifter, maybe someone passing through who thought the house looked easy to break into. But I knew that wasn't it. The way he smiled, the way he knocked on the window, it felt like he was enjoying it, like it was all a game to him. We never saw him again, but every time I visit my sister, I can't help but feel like he's still out there somewhere. Maybe watching from the trees, waiting. If you want to hear more stories like this, please like and subscribe. Also, check out my other videos.